The format for the roundtable essentially is I'm going to try to keep the conversation going, but we definitely want to take questions from the audience. So please, if you have a question during the course of the conversation, just step up to the microphone and then I'll cue you to ask the question. So I guess the logical thing to do here is start with some introductions, and I'd like the panelists to each introduce themselves and maybe just take a minute to explain who they are, what organization they work for, and what they do within that organization.
Hi, my name is Eugene Heeger. I'm with the Calgary Board of Education. I recognize that some of you are not from Calgary, so I thought I'd tell you who the CBE is. We're actually the second largest educational body in Canada, and we have over 107,000 students. In fact, someone told me a statistic this morning, which I didn't realize, that if we put all our students together, they would represent the third largest city in Alberta. We're a $1 billion organization, and in terms of facilities, we have 225 schools. These are public schools across Calgary. So that gives you a sense of scale. I'm delighted with this conference today because I think there are a number of issues we have to look at. If we look at our assets and our inventory, we've been around for 125 years. So we have 65% of our facilities that are 50 years old and require some serious modernization. So I see this as an opportunity of introducing modeling into the process. As far as my own responsibilities go, I'm involved in or responsible for architectural engineering services, real estate development, leasing, and urban planning. And then the most important department, and that's the reason why I'm here today, is I'm also responsible for the technology piece within the system, and that is a department which we call Integrated Workplace Management Services, and I'm pleased that my manager is here today, Murray Hunt. And what we've just completed is our first 5-year strategy. We're using Archibus as our platform. We manage our space planning, and we have a fully integrated CMMS system in terms of electronic work order systems, and we're moving into mobile computing as well. But we are just submitting our next 5-year strategy, which focuses on BIM. And part of the conversation is, will Alberta infrastructure be ahead of us in their standards, or will we have to roll out our standards ahead of infrastructure? So I think that's an interesting conversation because we have a 5-year plan. We want to start looking at the industry. We are expecting our industry partners to be ready with their systems because that's going to be a requirement. So we'll be looking at our standards, and hopefully by 2018, 2019, we would expect to start introducing that data for analytics into the facilities management and operations management side of the business we're in.
My name is Huey Liu with Cogent Industrial Technologies. I worked on the Edmonton International Airport for the last 2 years on the facility management software. We've also created a software we called ECT, the equipment commissioning tool, that brought all the assets into commissioning and then be able to bring that into the asset management system for the CMS software.
Hi, Jason Sadovia with Ontracks Consulting. We implement enterprise asset management software, or CMMS, some of you may know it as. I'm really excited about BIM because quite often when we're doing greenfield facilities, we're always struggling to populate asset information, spare parts, that type of information associated with specifications. I know was a hot topic earlier, so having that information readily available would definitely help implement our processes a lot faster.
My name is Susan Specht. I'm with the City of Calgary. I currently lead the Project Management Office for Corporate Properties and Buildings. We are currently running some BIM projects. We are looking to establish some of our protocols and how those are going to impact the industry. And yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
Hi, I'm Leslie Boyer, and I'm founder of SiteBIM. We are a service provider of laser scanning, and brought our laser scanner with us. We collect point clouds. We digitally document the built environment so that a model can be created at the beginning of a design process and integrated with the design for development of steel, of other building elements within a renovation project. We can also use scanning in regular construction or new construction where the scans overlap to show progress development. Not only does our scanner do point clouds, but it also takes photographs, photo imagery, and these can be overlaid as well to show progress and create a record. At the end, we can also use this technology for creating as-built documentation that can be used in facility management. Thank you.
I'm Tony Valente with Edmonton Airports. I manage the engineering and planning department. A lot of my activity resolves around how projects, which we typically hire a third-party consultant and contractor to deliver, but how do they integrate back into the existing facility? My department's responsible for doing checks on capacity of different mechanical, electrical systems. And so we're constantly going back to as-built data, commissioning data to determine if the systems can support whatever addition a specific project is planning on making. And where I find a lot of interest in BIM is a lot of this information is captured in the design, but we lose it through different phases of the project. And then by the time we get to a new project 5 or 10 years later, all of that information learning is lost, and we have to go recreate it, and usually at a considerable time as well as expense.
So I'm really happy that we have six people that are from the local area, and I think it's great that we have a bit of a cross-section of owners and vendors, and this will give us a good opportunity to understand what the vendors can offer and what the owners want to get long-term for their use. So Eugene, you mentioned that you're familiar with Archibus, and that's the platform that you chose to use or implement within your organization. So how did you come to that decision, and what kind of criteria did you use, and what kind of functionality does that system allow the organization?
Good question. The decision to use Archibus was made about 6-7 years ago, when the original the 5-year strategic plan was developed. So that was prior to me arriving, but I understand that they looked at a number of vendors, and in terms of the long-term strategy, Archibus was felt to be the appropriate platform. And of course, we had a series of modules that were introduced over time. So while I specifically mentioned CAFM, because space management is an important piece in terms of reporting utilization areas to Alberta education as opposed to infrastructure, the other most important piece was the computerized work order systems for our operations staff. We've continued a series of other modules in terms of leasing, the leasing module. We're rolling out the project management module. We have hazardous material inventory, which we track. And in fact, it's interesting, last year at the International Archibus Conference, we were awarded the Visionary of the Year award. And the interesting thing is we're actually using the software as well to track other issues or elements in the system. So, for instance, we can track banned instruments. We can tell you exactly where the instruments are located in a particular room, in a particular school, in a particular part of the city. So we've used it very aggressively, so to speak, and we feel that in terms of where we need to move is to now move into the building information modeling requirements, because that served our purpose and will continue to serve our purpose, but of course in terms of the documentation that we currently have to manage, the data sets that we have to manage, BIM is the way of the future.
Your system was initially sort of populated by the 2D CAD information you had available, or you set out to create that to put into the system?
We set out the standards, and then we have our consultants providing us with the CAD information. We have a CAFM administrator, then that translates that information into the Archibus system.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Archibus system is the system of record, as opposed to the CAD information.
As I understand it, Archibus has a module that will take in Revit. So is that
absolutely
the plan is to start to utilize that?
That will be part of the strategy in moving forward. But I have to stress, because we are constrained by processes and procedures identified by Alberta Infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So obviously there needs to be coordination between the two parties. And that's why I referenced earlier that I'm hoping that infrastructure also is working on their standards, because we would not want to have standards that are incompatible with the infrastructure requirements. So all our procurement processes are governed, because we are public sector, by Alberta Infrastructure within this province. Mm-hmm. And so that is a very important consideration.
I just want to give a chance for Hugh and Jason jump in and talk a little bit about Maximo. You're both using Maximo, is that correct? Or is
yeah, sorry. So we're an integrator, so we implement Maximo for a lot of our customers.
So you would work with a client to help them implement the use of Maximo, which is also a CMMS, a computerized management system.
Right. So in the case Eugene was talking about is we'll consume that information and load it into Maximo, and it's always a vein of contention, I guess, is where that information's coming from and how it's going to be populated. It's a piece that's often overlooked in the construction phase or budgeted for. So at the end of the capital project, you've got, in some cases, binders of information. Sometimes you're lucky enough to get it in flat files, but it's in compartments of various people's, computers, desks, that kind of stuff. And so loading that and getting that information to the system is critical in order to be able to operate the facility efficiently.
So will Maximo take in a Revit file at this time, or is it brings in CAD and manages information against a CAD background, or what's its current capabilities?
It depends what the export functionality is of Revit. It's a web-based application, so it can consume web services if we want to build like a live integration. We can do flat file loading if we want to do like one-time type loads into the system. So those are the two main ways that we would load data.
And the main function of these systems would be a frequency-based system that creates work orders based around the need to, say, perform work to the buildings and maintain the assets. Is that a fair statement? That's the main function?
It's fair. I guess we could extend it a little bit and say it's also meter-based and condition-based as well. So as we get more mature in our management of our facilities, and modeling can play into that as well. But we can do time-based, where you might have a particular HVAC system that you have to check every 6 months, mm-hmm. Or you might have a redundant system, and so it's more meter-based when it's actually being used, or whether it's in the redundant phase.
So Susan, the City of Calgary is set out on this endeavor to, I guess, pilot the use of BIM for asset management, facilities management. Does the City of Calgary use a similar system or one of these systems?
We use a number of systems, and that's our problem, right? And I think that's a lot of common problems between large organizations. Our maintenance management system is Oracle-based. So we do a lot of things through PeopleSoft and that kind of thing. So our maintenance management system is run through that. Our space management inventory system is Archibus. So we run into issues where it's just trying to find compatibility, and that's where we are currently running test pilots with the end deliverable being Naviswork models with linked files, so that we can provide that to our facility guys for them to test it out, because we're getting a lot of resistance initially from our facilities group as to how they're going to actually leverage this information. So we're currently using the information that we're getting out of our BIM pilot projects as being basically virtual twins, with the ability for them to access all of the O&M manuals, specs, and everything right from the model. We are not leveraging that information as of yet into our maintenance management systems. We are testing the water slowly. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback from our groups, and our next round of pilot projects will be that next step into those maintenance management systems.
So Eugene mentioned that he had 120 schools, or 225 schools, that they have to have a program in place to track all the maintenance activities and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
The city of Calgary probably has a similar problem, if not a larger problem, the number of square feet that you're maintaining and whatnot. So is that currently managed through sort of a infrastructure of people that are responsible for certain assets, and they sort of set the agenda on what to maintain and how to maintain it?
Yes, it's currently run through a sort of a section orientation. I believe that there is 4 districts by quadrant, essentially, and they are running them through maintenance supervisors, essentially.
So what percentage of the assets are you maintaining actively current as-built?
Corporate Properties and Buildings itself manages, I believe it's 275 facilities within the city. The city of Calgary itself owns close to 550 facilities.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a large square footage to manage.
Yeah.
That's where there's a lot of challenge for us to integrate with Maximo and that kind of thing, because we are so established into our existing systems, and that's where we are very interested in the open BIM solutions, and so how we can get that common language back and forth between all of these solutions.
Yeah. And receiving the information, I would imagine, at the end of the project in a way that you can use it into the future.
Exactly. Thank you. We are currently specifying that all of our data come in a COBI format so that we can leverage that in the future. We, as I said, we're just not there yet, but we want to have that flexibility and ability to move that into the future. So that is part of our specification process currently. I would like to note, though, like our specification process currently is not as prescriptive as a lot of people would like it to be. And they keep coming to these things, and everybody talks about the owner has to outline every detail that they want. It's just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
We are very open, and we believe in the integrated design process, and we believe in creating and forming teams early on into the process. And part of that is developing what those expectations and outputs are going to be as a team to find that collective group. So I think we're more interested in having collaborative teams, and we actually brought on a CM design assist contractor on one of our BIM projects. At the early stage of schematic design, they were actually there at the programming meeting, so it was a new experience for the whole table all around, so it's been positive that way.
So Tony, the airport must obviously have a similar type of problem maintaining as-builts. Getting the information, as you mentioned, was a major challenge in a way that you could use it. If it was a blue sky scenario and you could spec or get exactly what you wanted, what would be your vision for a perfect scenario for the construction of a new building?
That's a pretty wishful thinking, I think. Like typically, where we lose information in the data that's transferred to us, it's a lot in the. I would say we get really good architectural documents, so either models or CAD drawings. It's the mechanical and electrical that we find is deficient. Like, for example, we might get 200 radiant panels installed for a project, and we won't get any data back on where the shutoff valves are, where and Huey can actually speak to this because he's having to design our graphical system. So we get an as-built from and it's not, we typically deliver projects with a construction management approach, and it's not the CM that's fault, it's his sub, so his mechanical sub-trade doesn't redline the markups, and then we turn it over to an integrator for a building management system. And one example was we had something, I think it was like 200 thermostats, and not one was accurate. So like 0% accuracy in our red line documentation. Of course, we then provide that to another party to do our graphics, and we're basically having to rework again. So, we're way off ideal situation. So getting our MEP data in a better, more reliable, more appropriate format would be a long step for us, and I don't know if other owners have similar experiences in getting their information back.
So are you maintaining as-builts for the facility, and if so, how are you managing that? Do you have a department of people that are responsible for it, and what types of systems are you using to do that?
Yeah, we have we call it technical services, and it's our drafting department, and it's their job to consolidate a lot of the information, but typically, because we're executing so many projects at a time, their data is often significantly out of date, and so I guess we usually try to accommodate that and fail. By when a new big project comes in, we try to make the prime consultant responsible for accurately as-builting the facility before they start, and that isn't very successful strategy either.
Do you envision challenges with the different softwares that are involved through the process? Like, for example, the consultants may be using Revit, but the detail of actually what was built emerges in different formats from the subcontractors. They may be using a purpose-built system like QuickPen to do their piping and ductwork, and that model will be more accurate. So have you guys studied that process to understand what information's emerging and how to utilize it long term? Or
we use Bentley systems, and we have a few licenses of Autodesk products to do some translation sometimes, but we've been pretty successful in no matter what software package the work is developed in, when it's turned over to us, we can translate it into something usable. I would say that the issues we have predominantly are it's not modeled correctly, or the model is, we could have changed the infrastructure since the model was last touched.
So Leslie, if you were to approach a problem where you had an existing airport that wasn't documented, and the client wanted the whole project built in 3D, how would you approach that problem?
It would be quite a challenge. It would be a wonderful challenge. It would certainly working with the owner to determine what areas were most critical and where the greatest detail was really needed. Certainly focusing on the mechanical and electrical systems would be considered. That it would simply be systematically going through the building and collecting scans, registering those scans together, and then having a large point cloud that we would model from. And it would be then broken into, in the Revit model, could be broken down into various segments.
So the process of scanning in the field allows you to capture the three-dimensional geometry of a space so that you can grab that and bring it back to a BIM software to develop the model from, I guess, is the overall strategy.
Yes, that is the strategy, and that is how it works. That is the flow.
Yeah.
So once the information is gathered and a basic model is added, it can be created, you can then take the model and enhance it as much as to the levels that you want, such as identifying by layer or by component, whether it's a supply or return.
So, Huey, you're working on the airport project.
Yes.
And from my understanding, I'm not an expert in your field, but my understanding is that you're managing the BSA work and the integration of the systems, or what is the...
We primarily worked on the FMS for the graphical component of...
Sorry, can you speak into the microphone there?
The graphical component of the facility, and we also created a software to capture, digitize the equipment as they're installed, and that's, you know, the information was intended so that that database could be pushed right into the CMS software, as well as bring the information such as location.
So as the project was built, you were collecting information on each asset serial numbers,
Well,
part
whatever
numbers,
was available that we
whatever
could
information is
capture.
available.
Right.
And you're capturing that into a database, or you're actually building a CAD file or a graphical interface, or
We're capturing a database, yes.
in a database, and that database is in COBie format to be delivered to the client, or what's the format?
It was in a database that we built, not in the COBie format, but we were piloting another project in COBie format to extract and put it into Maximo.
Okay. So, Eugene, what is the number one challenge that you encounter managing so many assets, where I'm sure there are many things that fall between the cracks where they don't get maintained, or just managing people to keep on top of maintenance schedules and whatnot? And how is implementing this system, or the setup of this system, improved or address those challenges?
Money is always a challenge.
Yeah. It's everybody's
I should
problem.
say the budget is always a challenge. But on a serious note, I think it's a recognition that we have to do more with less. And every year, that's what we're facing. A need to work smarter, a need to introduce technology so that we can, in fact, respond quicker. And it's something that I think I should stress, because some people forget the dynamics of a school environment, and many of you are parents. It's a problem when kids can't study in a particular space. And my colleagues and I have a philosophical view that, and we refer to the third teacher. The third teacher is the space and the environment that we create, all of us. And it's very important, therefore, that if there's an issue or problem in that space, we get our operations people, our maintenance people out there as quickly as possible to deal with that interruption, because that's our focus, education at the end of the day. So from a facilities perspective, we're constantly looking at smarter ways to deal with operational issues. And obviously from a capital perspective, we're also concerned about the products we get. And this is the front end side when it comes to the collaboration piece, and we've heard it before. Buildings being handed over with incomplete information, as-built that are not reflective of, the specifications originally promised. So all of this becomes quite important. And our view is we need to see the problem from a total life cycle perspective. And that's, I think, the objective of what we're trying to do here.
Have you studied the return on investment for setting up that system? Like, I would imagine the old system was more manual-based, more antiquated, and this system's faster response time.
That's part of our strategic plan that we're looking at right now. So the very first piece of that is to look at the cost impacts, and that's being done by Murray. So I don't think we're naive around recognizing that there isn't a cost associated with this. But I think what's important, I go back to the challenge around the players in this room, and that is everyone recognizing their part to play in this. I'm also particularly concerned about the procurement processes that we are obliged to use. There's a reluctance to go, and this may not apply in the private sector, where it's easier to argue that construction management is a better option. But in the public sector, there's a belief that the lowest bid is the best bid. And we end up looking at the traditional design, bid, build approach, which someone else also pointed out that may not be the ideal procurement method to use this particular system. But irrespective of procurement method, I think there needs to be buy-in on the part of government, because they're the ones who provide the funding, and we have to work within those guidelines.
So, open question for the whole table. We've talked about new technologies and regarding asset management and whatnot. Is anyone doing research on or implementing a strategy to use IP-enabled devices to track data on assets and collecting that information across a network?
Yeah, I guess I can answer that first. Automation is a big thing for us because Maximo, being a relational database, it collects a lot of information. And so one of the downsides we hear after an implementation is, well, now I have tradespeople that I pay a lot of money to sitting in front of a computer entering information. And so how can we get that data into the system and in more of a real-time fashion? So there's a lot of automation out there, depending on what industry you're in, that you can use, whether it's telemetry or Wi-Fi or IP-enabled devices. But if you can get that information in some sort of historian format or something, we can definitely connect to that, get that information into Maximo, and then start to make some of our asset management and maintenance decisions based on, you know, like I said, the meter readings in the temperature scenario. If you have like a pressure and a temperature and a vibration analysis or something, not only can you look at the individual characteristics of those meters, but you can look at them in conjunction and start to analyze failure signatures and failure patterns in the past and start to be able to predict failures in the future.
If I could add, we are looking at that as well, and I think it's a very important aspect to it. Part of our problem, though, is you have different BAS systems in many of our facilities, so it's a question of ensuring that we're getting some consistency with our BAS systems, and then we can look at real-time monitoring, including using the results of that to, once again, wirelessly send signals to change conditions, particularly in the remote facilities that we have, because part of the difficulty too, as you know, Calgary doesn't have a traffic problem, so getting around the city is not easy. So again, it links back to this need for efficiency, for getting things done quickly, and these systems, we believe, will help in doing remote controls using IP addresses.
So the concept is like power over Ethernet, so that every device can be controlled across a network, and then all those individual devices can be controlled at once. So for example, if you want to turn off the lights in an entire facility, it's a push of a button through a system.
What you'll find is, besides doing capturing on historians real time, you could do separate data loggers. You can go back and capture later on. So it doesn't have to be live all the time. But one of the things we also do, we do industrial controls. So for an operations, if they have a piece of equipment that has to be changed out or have an inspection, it's automated, and that gets driven to do a change out on a die, for example, or it has to require an automated transfer to the work order system. And so there's different patterns that we look for besides time or number of cycles or high amperage usage over time. And so there's patterns that you start to pick up.
So I'll just like to open it up to the table to maybe ask questions of the audience, since we have the brain trust of Calgary in the BIM world. You know, as Eugene, maybe as an owner, you have a specific thing that you'd like to ask of the group, or if anyone else wants to jump in and ask a question to the audience and prompt them to get to the microphones to ask questions.
Alan Partridge, Group 2. Question I have, Eugene, you mentioned just recently in a comment, it was very telling, that we have to think of the life cycle. The challenge we have with the present procurement methodologies that we have is that they don't work. And we repeatedly keep seeing evidence that it doesn't work. And it's almost like a doctor has told you you've got cancer, you've got 2 months to live, go get your life in order, enjoy 2 months. And you say, no, I've got to keep, and on you go. When we face as architects, there are 3 costs that make up a building. The first cost is a capital, second is operation, third cost is the staff and benefits. We are always driven to the first cost. So at what point do you think you can begin to look at all 3 costs as the costs given to the team and incentivize them to, if they're not delivering things, then incentivize? One of the best ways is dip into the pocket and take money out of it. That's usually a good way to deal with it. At what point do you think that we could get to the point, not just for the Calgary Board of Education, but collectively as we think of owners, to that point that we stop thinking of the first cost and we think of all 3 as being the project budget that we're dealing with?
I think very profound question and very, very relevant in that, as we all know, most of the cost is during the operational period. I think this is the fierce conversation that needs to be held with infrastructure, in that infrastructure sets the standards. And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to dump on infrastructure, but we do have a Department of Infrastructure in this province, and I'm not sure what happens in other provinces. And the cost models, the cost per square foot allowance that we get for capital projects are driven by that entity. Some of you may not be aware because we're always in the news as the Calgary Board of Education, but we don't fund schools, just in case you didn't know that. We wait for capital to be provided by the provincial government for those schools. But to address your question directly, I agree with you entirely. This lowest cost approach is not necessarily the best approach. We've also been subjected over the past few years with this round of P3 projects, which is a different form of procurement. So on one level, we're also ending up, and I'm not ungrateful for the schools we get, but we end up with products, with assets, where I think we can go through the whole cycle as well and say, what are we getting for that? The theory being, well, you're not going to worry about operation and maintenance, so don't worry about that, except in 30 years' time, we will get the asset. What are we getting? So, and even with those P3 schools, I don't think BIM is contemplated. I don't think some of those issues are contemplated. It's about the lowest cost tender. So I think we need to work as professionals, as owners, as government representatives, and I think this conversation should continue, because as much as we end up sitting down with design teams and appearing to be the ones saying, oh, well, you've got to cut back, you can't do this, and you can't do that, and you know, you look at specifications and you take the lowest cost, which is not necessarily the best value for money from a life cycle perspective, we have problems. So I can only encourage us as a group. I do believe in looking at BIM, in looking at this modeling process, that the benefits will be seen, and I think there could be a recognition that in using this particular approach, it could change or slightly alter the fear that appears to exist in terms of the procurement options that are available. Because I've always believed design, bid, build is not necessarily the best cost option, particularly if you look at the cost of maintenance and the cost of operating facilities that have been built in the cheapest possible way.
So with the P3 model, there's bundling of responsibilities in that the designer, the builder, and the facilities manager all have to work together, and their price is based on the maintenance over that period of time. So
correct.
There's an incentive to make sure that the building is durable and easy to maintain.
For them.
For them, yes.
Missing from that equation, I didn't hear you say the owner or the user.
Well, the responsibility, I don't know how the projects were procured out here, but a lot of times the responsibility of maintenance is on the facilities manager and part of that consortium, and therefore they have to maintain it to the level that's been laid out.
That is
so
correct.
They take that risk, and therefore there's an incentive to ensure that the building is easy to maintain, which is interesting in that if you include, say, energy costs in that,
right,
there'd be a greater incentive to do more engineering to make the buildings as efficient as possible from an energy perspective. So is bundling the risk together maybe part of that solution, or do you see that as an issue?
No, I believe that there are advantages to the P3 contractor and to government in terms of buying a number of facilities which will suit their needs. But I have to stress this, that the important player in this process is missing, and that is the user. We accept this facility. We're not part of that design. Mm-hmm. We have to live in those facilities, and we're not part of operating it or managing it. And I have to stress that, and I'm sure those of you who are in the medical profession here, the way you operate a hospital is very different to the way you operate a school, is very different to the way you operate a commercial building downtown. I go back to what I mentioned earlier. Our focus from a facilities perspective, I know it's hard to believe, but we measured by that in our KPOs, is how do we ensure that the environment for education is what drives our decision. That's a very different approach to looking at facility mm-hmm. problems and solutions.
It's an interesting digression, but it's pretty far off our topic, so maybe I'll steer it back. But Susan, maybe you must have a similar problem when the City of Calgary procures projects. How do you bridge that gap between on a traditional project and then some of the other types of procurement that you've been involved with? How do you bridge that gap between the user groups that must occupy these buildings that you're set out to maintaining and procure, and to the designers and the builders to make sure that the end product is exactly what you need, and what challenges are in there, and how can BIM help to communicate and bridge that gap?
Sure. One of the largest things that we are currently and actively pursuing on a number of projects is integrated project delivery. It's huge for us right now, and we are actively pursuing it, like I said, because it is alleviating a lot of these concerns for us. We're able to bring our user groups to the table early into the project. We're getting their input, we're getting facilities on board. By having this all modeled through BIM, and we've actually done a project that was completely paperless up until permitting. So all of the design reviews, everything else was done in a room live with the group. It took a long time, but it was well worth it. It was a good experience all around. We had the user group there. They were able to actually see their space. They had their comments and their concerns addressed at that time. We had our engineering specialists in the room. Their concerns were addressed at the time. It was a very collaborative process, and that is sort of the direction that we're heading. Our contractual procurement methodologies, we're able to suggest which procurement methodologies we would prefer on these projects. We're not bound to go design, bid, build, so we often are using projects like this in more of a construction management methodology, using a design assist model within that construction management methodology. That's been positive so far. We are looking at different initiatives coming up this year that I can't really speak about just yet, but we are looking for volunteers. So if anybody's out there that's architecturally or construction that wants to participate, let me know. But yeah, we are looking at different procurement opportunities within this environment to help that collaborative approach.
And Tony, the airport just completed a major project. What was the type of contract there, and was BIM used, and what was the result of that from your perspective?
So for our major program, we used a construction management with design assist approach. I would say that approach was chosen over other methods in that it allowed us to fast track the schedule. I think that was the main driving factor for the decision of that delivery, because then you can break, with your construction manager, you can break it into different work packages and tender them at different times. But I'd like to talk towards the procurement methods tend to be where do you want to shift the risk to, and just my opinion is that it's usually the owner or the user, as Eugene's pointing out, that contractually the risk might not fall on them, but they always end up with the risk. And so as Alan had pointed out before, these procurement methods don't necessarily provide the best value. So we have to think of, as professionals, fee-based approaches, design, bid, build, that kind of methods don't necessarily provide the best value for the users. And at least with the airport, one of the reasons why we like the construction management approach is it allows us to somewhat partner with the contractor from the beginning of the project. So it makes it a little less adversarial. I wouldn't say it's by any means the most ideal method for delivery. But some of the issues that we had, that like our BIM delivery, even with the construction management, is really led by the architectural design. Mechanical, electrical didn't quite make it into the BIM model, and I don't know if the construction managers actually benefited from the BIM model at all. We tended to work heavily in a paper-based format. My office had hundreds of pounds of paper from all the different, we did 30, 60, 90% submissions at design development, tender documents, construction documents, IFC documents. Now we're starting to get into as-built, and there'll probably be, you know, 5 revisions of those.
What on that? Like, what steps did the client take at the early stages to set up the consultants and engage the general contractors to ensure that they would use technology, like new technology, or did you at all? Like, from my perspective, I mean, that's what we'd like to see, is that the owners lead and set up the initial responsibilities.
Yeah.
So was there an initiative there, or what was
we originally we had set it up that we wanted the projects to be delivered in a CAD-based format, though when we were selecting through our RFP process, the designers, I'd say almost all of them that were pre-qualified and participated in the RFP, were bringing BIM as a value added. So we didn't as a client specify our requirements for BIM, and that's definitely why we didn't get the BIM models that we would have liked, because it was a value added service. It wasn't in the contract. Our contracts specified traditional 2D CAD submission.
I just want to make a couple of comments. First, on the funding issue, and I know P3 funding was discussed quite a bit. P3 funding, if you look at it, you know, at least from Alberta government perspective, it's a cash flow issue. Schools, we are looking at 360 payments over 30 years versus paying a lot of money up front in the first 3 years and then for operation and maintenance in the remaining years. Issue there with P3 as a model, I think, was that there was no flexibility to change things, change scope of work once the contract has been awarded. And that was a big issue with the province. Second thing I'd like to comment on is the as-built issue, and what I've been hearing from Tony is the largest gap, biggest gap between as designed and as built is for mechanical and electrical systems. And this may have to be because of the design culture we have. In mechanical and electrical systems, we're used to doing line diagrams. And then comes the second set of experts, who are the plumbers or electricians, and they understand the code very well too. So putting a couple inches an elbow this way or that way, or instead of putting a 90-degree T elbow versus 245s, they do those kind of things, and they don't get recorded. So that is an issue, and that's where we need to work.